All right, we continue now with your reporting here on In Focus. The Burkina Faso military has reported that one of their own and about 15 militants were killed in a battle in Eastern Komadjari Province over the weekend. The army says it enabled the neutralization of about 15 terrorists and the recovery of their weapons. A large quantity of ammunition and motorbikes were also seized. For more on this, I'm now joined by writer and commentator on African affairs, Joseph Ochieno. Joseph, good to have you with us tonight here on In Focus. I mean, when you look at the rise of the jihadist attacks in Burkina Faso, to what would you attribute this? Is it a cultural war? Is it a religious war? What is behind this uprising?
It's extremely worrying, very, very sad for this country. This is a country that has had relative political instability in the recent times since the overthrow of President Compaoré. And of course, interestingly, you could argue that the trials for those who assassinated popular President Sankara is just about now. But that said, I think in a way you're right, because yes, Burkina Faso is surrounded by very unstable northern neighbors, mainly Mali and Niger. You know, southern ends with Ghana and the rest of the relatively stable countries. We don't seem to see this. So really, I think it's much of the broader regional challenges facing the entire Sahel sub-region. But of course, it's worse in Burkina Faso, one, because of internal political instability, and of course, two, yes, by and large, the majority of the Burkinabe are Muslims, but ideally, it should not necessarily be that. This is a country which is generally actually relatively poor, but very, very politically conscious.
How should the government then be responding to this, Joseph?
I don't know. You know, it has been very systematic. In August, it was a shocker. Up to 80 people were killed, and the government reported to have killed 80 also thereabout of the rebels. September, the same thing happened. Just last month, about 15, that was official figures given by the state that were killed. So it seems to be something which is progressing, as it were, rather than receding. But as I said, I can only suggest that perhaps the political instability and the failure of the state machinery itself at the moment to basically curtail themselves means therefore that the jihadists will possibly take every chance. Yeah. Now, is it really a question of Islamic terrorists and other jihadists, or is it something associated with domestic political void which has been created as a result of the instability this country has seen in the last several days? I mean, several years. It's very, very difficult to tell. Quite clearly, there's something fundamentally going on wrong, and quite clearly, it's the case that we can't look at Burkina Faso in isolation. As I said, particularly its two other neighbors, mainly Niger and Mali.
Yeah. Many of us are saying, Joseph, that it's a product of the local socio-political and cultural conditions, and therefore the government should look at, for example, closing the gap, particularly, as you mentioned, some of the areas that are affected by these violence are areas which are removed from the economy, and therefore they feel that they are amongst the abundant members of the population.
I think, as I suggested at the beginning of the conversation, I was possibly being rather nuanced on this one, wasn't I? Quite clearly, I think that is a factor in itself. Of course, terrorism in whatever nature would normally want going away of Sankara into heaven. The literacy rate in Burkina Faso compared to many other African countries is possibly not particularly good. And considering the fact that I said is a country which is very, very much politically conscious, the literacy rate is not particularly high. But at the same time, it's generally a very, very poor country. So yes, the voids created by, if you like, the socio-economic inequalities, and particularly, generally, the poverty, particularly the fact that actually beyond gold, which is the main thing, and the basic crafts that some of these guys will possibly enjoy from tourists, and in recent times, because of the political instability, I'm not quite sure how many people will be wanting to get visas to visit Burkina Faso. So by and large, I think you're very, very
All right, challenges there with Joseph Ochieno in that connection, but that's where we leave it for tonight. Writer and commentator on African affairs, reflecting on the insurgents on the rise in Burkina Faso. Meanwhile, workplace mandates requiring vaccination against COVID-19 continue to be controversial in the U.S. The Biden administration is expected to respond this week to a recent federal court decision to temporarily hold federal vaccine mandate rules for large employers. And workers have staged. All right, back with us here on In Focus. Let's go back now to Joseph Ochieno, writer and commentator on African affairs. We established that connection with Joseph. Now, Joseph, I mean, you already pointed out, quite nuanced, the product that is this insurgency and what really is going on here. You're placing greater emphasis, particularly on the Sahel region and what needs to happen there, the emergency programs, development component that needs to go in there, and government responses. How do you think they should approach the question of strengthening cooperation in the long term between the judicial and the police cooperation between Mali and Burkina, so that they're able to at least facilitate some investigations and are able to effect some arrests?
I'm not sure whether the judicial processes in either countries will necessarily work. I think it's strengthening the security systems and the security services from all countries. I don't even think it will be a question for Mali and Burkina Faso alone. I think it's something that must include Niger. And I think the southern neighbors like Ghana, with their relatively established economies, they should not really think that they will be off the hook on this. I think generally, this is a matter that we all know is very much related to jihadist elements, which has now actually penetrated Africa and is sort of seemingly here to stay. It must be a general issue. Burkina Faso should be supported, really by and large, to strengthen its system. You're quite right. But beyond that, I think Niger must get involved. And so therefore, the regional board, as I said, ECOWAS, should really play a slightly much more strategic role than at the moment it is being played. What other nation states like the French normally play, I don't know, because as I said, many of the Africans within those regions really quite resent external forces operating in those areas. And these contradictions have been the presence of the French, the presence of the Americans, and indeed, in this case, the contradiction of the jihadists, which is basically, by and large, an Arab question. And that's why it's an irony, isn't it, that Sankara is being celebrated as the guy who possibly today, if he was there, maybe Burkina Faso would be a very different country, and by and large the region, and so would be the African continent.
Joseph, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Joseph Ochieno, writer and commentator there on African affairs, reflecting on that situation.